So what's one thing that you've been learning in this series? If you've been around during this series, what's one thing that comes to mind? Maybe just one big takeaway that you've had. And this is week number 20. So we've been in this series since April. We've taken a couple breaks here and there, but we've been in this series quite a while. So if you've been around for most of the series, does anything come to mind that you want to share? I just wanted to give an opportunity if people wanted to share. What comes to mind? What's one thing that you've learned? What's one big takeaway? Anybody want to share? Yeah, I just think, throughout this series, we've seen so many obstacles, to the covenant promises, the blessing. We've seen, throughout the series, we've seen, famine, we've seen infertility, we've seen just tremendous character flaws in the lives of these people. We've seen just incredible conflict within these families, and it just seems, as we've been reading and as we've been studying, it just seems like this family that's supposed to be the blessing is bringing more of a curse than a blessing, right? And it just seems, how could God really bring about his blessing? And how could he restore the nations and bring salvation through this family? There's so many obstacles that we've just seen God overcome, and it just shows me that there's nothing too big for God to overcome. So today we're going to cover 2 chapters in Genesis. One chapter that you're probably really familiar with if you've grown up in the church, about a specific character that you're probably familiar with, and then we're going to read another chapter that maybe a story that you're not so familiar with and a character that you're not necessarily familiar with. And we're going to see how these 2 chapters, these stories are connected. So we're going to start with Genesis chapter 37. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 37. We're going to be introduced to Joseph. Many of you know the story of Joseph, especially if you've grown up in the church and you've been in Sunday school before, if you've seen Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Most people are familiar with the story of Joseph. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So what do you think his brothers were doing? Well, obviously we don't know. Was Joseph just being a tattletale, like this just spoiled young brat, or were they doing something that that justified the bad report? Well, we don't really know, but this really sets up the story that's to come. This is not looking good for Joseph, right? Let's keep reading. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of the other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. He had made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word of him. So I want to stop there for a second. So Joseph obviously is the loved son of Jacob. He's the favorite son because he was born to Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. So when you have a favorite wife, there's a problem at that point, right? But this, it's not necessarily the favoritism that was the problem, although that wasn't good. I mean, they're kind of used to that in this family, right? The problem was the status that this coat represented. When Jacob gave Joseph this coat, this meant a particular status. Now, we're taught, and we've been taught since we were little kids, if we've grown up in the church and Sunday school, that this was a coat of many colors. This was a very colorful coat, or a striped coat, or a Technicolor Dreamcoat, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, you may see in your Bibles there's a footnote. The word used here is ornate. It's an ornate coat, and really this word in the Hebrew, they really have no idea what it means. And they struggle to translate it. What does this word ornate mean? Now, they've come to an agreement. In fact, many scholars, many translators believe that this word is actually what it's referring to is a long coat or a long-sleeved coat. In fact, the Young's translation, which is a word-for-word translation right from Hebrew to English, it just calls this coat a long coat. A long coat. Back in the ancient Near East, only important people would wear these types of coat. So this long coat or this long-sleeved coat would distinguish management from hired hands, which really explains a lot in the story, right? Because if Joseph is considered the manager and he's giving his dad bad reports about his brothers who are considered the hired hands, I mean, no wonder they're ticked at him, right? But besides all that, this may have something to do with the birthright. And we've been talking about the birthright. We've learned about the birthright a couple of times in this series. The birthright is what goes to the firstborn. And the birthright means that the firstborn will receive a double portion of the father's estate. So who's the firstborn? Reuben. Reuben's the firstborn, but the Bible tells us that Reuben was disqualified from receiving the birthright because he slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. Now we skipped over that, but if you want to read it, it's in chapter 35, verse 22. Reuben, that's what he did. He slept with Bilhah. So he was disqualified from the birthright. So the next in line was Simeon and Levi, but they also disqualified themselves from the birthright when they slaughtered an entire village of men at Shechem. We briefly talked about that last week. You can read all about that in Genesis chapter 34. So who's next in line? Judah. Judah's next in line to receive the birthright. But now Joseph receives this coat from his dad, which probably means he's receiving a second coat, a special coat, because everyone had one coat back in that day. The brothers would have had a coat. They would have received a coat from their father, but this was a special coat. This was a double portion, which probably indicates that Jacob is he's fed up with his sons from Leah, the wife that he didn't like so much anyway. And he's gonna skip over Judah, and he's gonna go right to his favorite son, Joseph, and give him the double portion. Which, when we get to the end of Genesis, we see that's really the case. That's what happens, and we'll get to that later. But Joseph does receive the double portion. But if you think through all this, no wonder his brothers were ticked. No wonder they were jealous. No wonder they hated him. Especially Judah. Especially Judah. Let's keep reading. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose up and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Give me another report on how your brothers are doing." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they're grazing their flocks?" "They moved on from here," the man answered. I heard them say, "Let's go to Dothan." So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Now, I just want to stop here for a second. Sometimes we we skip over some, some strange details, and, these details don't stand out to us. But I think sometimes the details are where we get some lessons. And, so Joseph's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this isn't like a densely populated city or anything. He's out in the middle of nowhere, and he just happens to run into this guy who just happens to have overheard that the brothers, where the brothers were headed, just so happens to know, and just so happens to lead Joseph in the right direction. I think right here in the middle of the story is a reminder of God's providence. The author wants us to see that God is at work. God is at work behind the scenes, and God is at work in the details, and God is at work in this messy situation that we're going to read about. Now, most of you are aware of where the story's headed, right? You know what happens at the end. At the very end of the story, and so this is kind of a spoiler alert, but we'll get to this. At the very end, Genesis chapter 50, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." So God had a plan. God was at work in the midst of this, even in the details, even when no one realized he was at work, and even in the mess. Verse 18, "But they saw him in the distance," his brothers saw him in the distance, "and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. 'Here comes that dreamer,' they said to each other. 'Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams.' When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. 'Let's not take his life,' he said. 'Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him.' Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father." So Reuben, what's Reuben doing here? Maybe Reuben's, trying to regain trust with his father. Maybe he's trying to get back on his father's good side. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, this ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming toward them. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. Wow, what a guy Judah is. We don't have to kill him, but let's just sell him. Let's just sell him. And Judah's suggesting this possibly because, who would be in line to get the birthright again? He would. Of course, he's gonna benefit. Verse 28, "So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and told him and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt." So we've got Midianites, we've got Ishmaelites, and so this is just an interesting tidbit. So the Ishmaelites, you may remember, are descendants of Abraham through his servant Hagar. We talked about that several weeks ago. And the Midianites were descendants of Abraham through his second wife, Keturah. I don't think we really talked about that, but after Sarah passed away, he married Keturah, and these, are the descendants. So these traders are probably uncles to Jacob, maybe even, second or third cousins to Joseph and his brothers. Verse 29, "When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, 'The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?' Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, 'We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe.' He recognized it and said, 'It's my son's robe.'" So right here, they show this robe, examine this robe, and Jacob recognizes it. And right here is a literary connection to the story in the next chapter. So keep that in mind. We're going to come back to this. He recognizes it. It's my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Let's keep reading. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. And so we're kind of left on the edge of our seats. We're left hanging. We want to see what's going to happen next to Joseph. And we turn the page to chapter 38 because we want to find out what's going to happen. I mean, this is an intriguing story. The next chapter says nothing about Joseph. It seems to be a completely unrelated story, but it's really not. In the next chapter, which is chapter 38, we're introduced to Judah again. We're reintroduced to Judah. And it may seem just kind of like this random, strange story, but this is really important and there's a connection. So Genesis chapter 38, I'm just going to summarize this. I'm not going to read it verse by verse, and you can read it on your own this afternoon. You can read it throughout the week. And once again, viewer discretion advised. You might not want to read it with your kids. Sometime after the brothers got rid of Joseph, Judah marries a Canaanite woman named Shua. They have 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And now Judah then finds a wife for his first son, and her name is Tamar. But the text says that was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he was put to death. We don't know what happened. We don't know what he did. It must have been something pretty bad. So Tamar is a widow now, and Levirate marriage laws and even some ancient Near Eastern laws required, they said that if a woman's husband dies before they were able to have children, then it's the duty of the man's brother to produce a child through his brother's widow in order for his brother's family line to continue, and also, which was really important, to take care of the widow. However, Judah's second son, Onan, refuses to do this. He actually agrees with the sex part, but he makes sure that Tamar doesn't get pregnant. And once again, you may be familiar with the story or you may not be, but go ahead and read it to see how he does that. It's a little bit R-rated. The text says that what he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he was put to death as well. So here's Tamar. She's a widow. She has no means of taking care of herself, and this was a big deal in that day. This was a big problem, a big deal. And so Judah promises Tamar that when his third son, Shelah, grows up, when he's old enough, that he would be given to Tamar in marriage. But a long time passes, a really, really long time passes, and Judah's wife passes away. Judah grieves over her. By this time, Shelah's grown up, and Judah's forgotten all about Tamar. And actually, the Bible, the text kind of indicates that Judah was never really intended to do what he said he was going to do anyway. He really wasn't going to give his son to Tamar. In fact, it kind of indicates that maybe Judah thought that there was something wrong with Tamar, because his sons just kept dying when they were with him. So he didn't want a third son to die by being with her. So by this point, Tamar's desperate. So she decides to take matters into her own hands, and she dresses up like a prostitute. She puts a veil over her head, and she sits by the city gates. How many of you have heard this story before? A few of you have. She's sitting by the city gates, dressed as a prostitute, and here comes Judah. Judah sees her, doesn't recognize her, but he hires her for the price of a goat from his flock. He promises to send the payment later because he doesn't have the goat with him at the time. And so as a pledge, Tamar asked for his seal, his cord, and his staff. Now a seal was kind of like a stamp back in that day. It would be kind of like a signature. And it was used to make really important transactions. And a cord was probably worn around his neck to secure the seal. And then the staff was another very personal item. So this would have been kind of like leaving a driver's license, a credit card, a social security number for us today. Very, very important items that would identify Judah. So afterwards, Judah sends his servant with the goat for the payment, and the servant asks around for the prostitute. Of course, there is no prostitute. Tamar has resumed her life as a widow, and so to avoid embarrassment, the servant kind of lets it go and heads back home. 3 months later, Judah gets word that Tamar is pregnant. And here's his response. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. Remember that Judah, possibly thinks that maybe Tamar is to blame, that she's to blame for his son's deaths, that she's a wicked person, and now she's pregnant, which proves that she's wicked. So burn her. She should be burned. So they bring Tamar out to burn her to death, but she has a surprise. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these. She brings out Judah's seal and his cord and his staff. And it's right here in the text that we find a connection to the Joseph story in the previous chapter. Here's what we read. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Judah recognized them. Judah recognized them. And this right here is a literary connection. It's a flashback. It's a link. And it's probably included by the author, probably meant to point the readers back to the previous chapter, where something very, very similar happened. Do you remember? They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe. He recognized it. There's a connection here. It's because it's in this moment that Judah realizes his own wickedness. I mean, he's the guy. He's the guy who convinced his brothers to sell Joseph. He's the guy, that convinced him to be sold because, he wanted to get rid of the person, who posed a threat to him receiving the birthright. And he's the guy who played the major role in deceiving his father by presenting him with Joseph's bloody robe. He's been living a lie this entire time. He's the one who lied to Tamar, failed to take care of her in her desperate need. And he finally recognizes it. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I am, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. In other words, she may have done a wicked thing, a sinful thing, but I'm just as wicked. I'm just as sinful, if not worse. So at the end of the chapter, we read that Judah marries Tamar. And we read this really strange incident about the birth of their two twins. Let me read it. Verses 27 through 30. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out. And she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. And so Perez breaks through and triumphs over his brother, which points to the next few chapters, where we discover that Joseph, who was as good as dead, somehow, against all odds, breaks through and triumphs over his brothers, brings salvation to his family. So next week we're going to learn that Jacob is a man of character. He's a young man of character, finally someone good in the story. And yet, right here in the middle of the story of Joseph, there's this story of Judah and Tamar. What do we do with that? What's it all about? What can we learn from that? I have 3 takeaways, 3 lessons that I want to share. The first one's this. It's never good to point fingers. Tamar, out of desperation, she did a very sinful, wicked thing, right? She dresses up like a prostitute in order to deceive her father-in-law into having a child with her. But Judah, he was too quick to point fingers, right? She's wicked. She's a sinner. She should be burned. Until he recognized his things, his skeletons in the closet, his sinfulness. She's more righteous than I am. And it reminds me of, later on in the Old Testament, King David's sin. Remember when King David, takes Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, and sleeps with her, has a child with her, and then has Uriah killed in order to cover up his sin. And then he's finally confronted, and he says, I've sinned against the Lord. I've sinned against the Lord. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All means all. We're all undeserving. And all of us are in desperate need of God's grace. We all are. We're in desperate need of God's grace. And it's not just a one-time grace. Like we accept the grace that he presented on the cross for us. It's not just a one-time grace. We are all in desperate need of his grace every single day, moment by moment by moment. And I think it's best to adopt the attitude of the Apostle Paul. In his first letter to Timothy, he said, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. I'm the worst. It's never good to point fingers. And how's the saying go? Whenever you point a finger at someone, there's always three pointing right back at you. It's never good to point fingers. Number two, your story isn't over. Your story isn't over. When we turn to the New Testament, to the Gospel of Matthew, and we read in the very first chapter, there's this genealogy of Jesus. And we just skip over it because genealogies are boring. I mean, who reads the genealogies anyway? But in the genealogy of Jesus here in Matthew, we find something pretty shocking. If you were God, who would you choose to represent your family? Who would you choose to be in the family line of Jesus? Joseph? The favored one, the good guy, the hero in the story? Or Judah? The guy who sold his brothers into slavery, sold his brother into slavery, the guy who deceived his father, the guy who failed to take care of his daughter-in-law and slept with her. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Judah. He chose Judah. As we'll see later, Joseph received the birthright. He received the double portion. But the covenant promises and the blessing came through Judah. And the child that he bore with his daughter-in-law Tamar. I mean, isn't that remarkable? Let's talk about genealogies for a second. Back in that day, histories were recorded and genealogies were written down a lot of times to make the kings of that day and make the military leaders, the leaders of that day, look good. And so the historian was often hired to ensure that who they were writing about looked really, really, really good. So they would often exaggerate the good stuff and they'd leave out the bad stuff. That's not what we find in the Gospels, and that's not what we find here with Matthew's genealogy. He didn't have to include Tamar's name here, did he? He didn't have to include her name in the genealogy, but he also, later on, he included Bathsheba's name in order to highlight the sin of the great King David. I mean, Matthew, in the genealogy here, seems to go out of his way to include these messy, sinful stories. Why would he do that? I think it's because as he was recording all this stuff, he's writing this stuff down, he was remembering his own story. He was remembering his own messy, sinful, hopeless story. He was remembering how Jesus walked up to him when he was sitting at his tax collector booth, right in the act of treason, right in the act of fraud. And Jesus looked him in the eye and said, Matthew, follow me. And I think he was probably remembering how Jesus came to his house then, hang out with him. I mean, no rabbi would ever do that. but Jesus did, and he was probably remembering how Jesus came to hang out with him and his sinful buddies. And he was probably remembering how that just ticked the Pharisees off. I think Matthew was highlighting these stories because they're the point of the story. They're the point of the story. These names are included here in this genealogy to highlight the grace of God. How Jesus came to welcome sinners in order to save sinners, in order to change sinners. People like Judah, people like Tamar, people like Matthew, people like me, people like you. Your story isn't over. Your story isn't over. You haven't strayed beyond God's grace, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. Your story isn't over. And neither is fill in the blank. Your family member, your neighbor, your friend, your worst enemy, the person that you can't stand, whoever it is. And this may be the one thing that you need to remember this morning. Whoever it is, whoever comes to mind, they are someone who has a story. They have a story. And there's someone whose story isn't over yet. There's someone in need of God's grace. There's someone in need of your grace. And as we're going to discover in a couple weeks, Judah's story wasn't over. We'll see, and many of you know the story already, but Judah undergoes this massive change, and he goes from the one who wanted his brother out of the picture so that he could receive the birthright to the one who puts his life on the line for another brother, a younger brother named Benjamin. So Judah offers himself. Judah sacrifices himself in place of his brother. Picture of redemption. Right here, hidden in the story of Joseph. Picture of redemption. What a change. Judah's story wasn't over. Neither is yours, neither is mine, and neither is fill in the blank. Let's pray. And so hidden in the story of Joseph is the story of the redemption of Judah. And it's within Judah's story that we find the story of our Redeemer, the one who came to pay the price for our sin. So let's take this bread, be reminded that this is the broken body. This represents the broken body of Christ. Take and eat. And when Jesus was having his Passover meal with his disciples and he held up the cup, some believed that cup was actually called the cup of redemption. So take and drink for the remission of sins.